Chapter 25 Triumphed. Nothing enhanced an awkward moment quite like the grating, not quite silent rustle of chainmail beneath cloth. Hiccup supposed he wasn't helping the situation by willing Halfdan's back to combust into flames through the power of his stare, but then again he didn't care much for the comfort of the man. The party of three slowly made their way through the maze of stone and marble hallways. Columns and statues and windows, rugs and tapestries and ornaments, art and history and value surrounded Hiccup. Things so precious he could buy his own island, but the boy had no time to enjoy the sight. It didn't matter that such advanced architecture and shiny objects would usually have him salivating at the mouth. All of it could be ignored in light of keeping his full attention on the escort to his new quarters.
"Aye, for the last time, lad, I ain't here to cause trouble,"
Halfdan exclaimed when the heat of Hiccup's stare became too much in the stifling silence.
"Can I at least help you to—" "No."
Hiccup returned flatly and leaned more heavily onto Toothless. The silk rope, provided for him slipped a bit against the smooth scales, throwing more of his weight into the Night Fury than he intended. Toothless didn't budge in his support. He'd never say this to Hiccup, knowing how sensitive the boy was about the situation, but the loss in weight was more noticeable than ever at times like these. It hardly strained his neck to uphold most of his human. The dragon's toxic stare mimicked Hiccup's in both orientation and intensity, and it dared the Viking to push his luck any farther than he already had. Halfdan quickly went back to leading them through the palace halls. Hiccup released a small sigh once Halfdan's eyes faced forward. He already felt weary from all the walking he had done that day. He didn't need any stress added to his physical drain. Any and all relaxation brought on by the massage had fled his body, thanks to Halfdan's presence. The man insisted he was there on goodwill, and goodwill alone, having volunteered to take the travelers to the new room when all other candidates, Empress included, were too busy. Volunteered, Hiccup mentally scoffed. Either Halfdan wanted a private revenge for them getting off so easily, or he wanted to finish the job Harold couldn't himself. The Viking's outstanding friendly demeanor would not fool him.
"You look good,"
Halfdan began conversationally.
"Clean."
"Shut up." Halfdan laughed, taking the curt response in stride.
"Good to see your attitude's not changed much."
Hiccup didn't favor him with any more responses, realizing there was little he could say that offended the man. Halfdan was too easygoing, too accepting once something was acceptable to be accepted. Hiccup would never trust him.
"That's quite a feat, is all I'm saying. To have your mind and all that. I mean, a near-death experience like that. Better men than you have come out mere shells of themselves, even after they physically recover. But you seem to be doing all right, considering."
"Like you've ever met a better man," Toothless scoffed, loyal as ever. It earned him an affectionate scratch behind an ear plate. Halfdan may not have understood the dragon's words, but he certainly understood the low snarl that accompanied them. His shoulders jumped at the noise.
"Look,"
Halfdan tried again. He dragged a hand through the vibrant red length of his hair in a sudden and isolated show of discomfort.
"I know Harald won't say it, but I'll gladly apologize."
Hiccup, momentarily forgetting his hard display of mistrust, goggled at the broad reach of Halfdan's back. Did he just... Unbeknownst to Hiccup, his feet began to break as his mind tried to rework Halfdan's declaration into something far more malicious, something more bearable. Toothless shouldered the small of his back into keeping up the slow but manageable pace. "I can only sense honesty," the dragon contributed, though he sounded as perturbed as Hiccup felt. It probably took all of Toothless's self-control to keep from giving the man a good bite in the butt. After all, Halfdan didn't hold nearly as much sway with the Varinjar as Harald did. Unfortunate accidents befalling him could be forgiven and overlooked. Halfdan must have sensed a reaction other than stony silence because he chanced to look over his shoulder. Hiccup quickly squared his face again, but he feared the damage had been done. Sure enough, Halfdan smiled wider.
"Don't expect you to trust me, of course,"
the large man continued.
Horrible thing that happened to you.
Mighty ballsy of you, though. Ain't no one gonna argue about that. A bunch of the guys wanted to do right by you and help you get your strength back. When you can move better, that is.
Halfdan kept his pace slow as he spoke, kept his back to the Viking and dragon in a show of trust, kept a good, agreeable distance so not to upset the boy any more than he was. And Hiccup hated him for it. He hated the consideration Halfdan showed him, hated the respect when, just a month prior, he had been bruising Hiccup's ribs for mouthing off. He shouldn't have to work to stay mad at a Viking. It should be easy. Hiccup didn't know if he could forgive himself if he forgave one of them. He glanced down at the long, rangy legs moving the silken robe, cloth that felt like water on his body. They ached from misuse. The muscles were worked overtime today and promised severe retribution in the morning. He focused on this pain as well as the cramping burn in his back, a gnawing sensation that seemed destined to linger forever. Once he got a firm hold on the disturbing realization that he couldn't remember what his back felt like before the axe, hating Halfdan came easier.
Well, here we are.
Hiccup lifted his eyes from the floor, passing over Halfdan's form so that he would be nothing more than a silhouette in his memories, and focused directly on the room beyond the open doorway Halfdan presented. He moved first, separating himself from Toothless and taking unhurried, easy steps into his new quarters. He could feel Toothless follow closely behind him, there to make sure Halfdan didn't try anything. The Viking stood stock still, leaning against the wall and avoiding any and all movements remotely threatening. Much like his experience walking through the very public streets of Miklagard, Hiccup had the insane urge not to show a shred of weakness as his own actions came under the scrutiny of an enemy. He tightened his stomach muscles, straightened his posture, oh, how his back screamed in protest, and made each step as strong and purposeful as he could. Thankfully, it was a short walk over the threshold, and Hiccup's artful mind finally and forcefully overtook his stubborn protective instinct. The room was more beautiful than the hallway. Solid white marbled walls stretched up into the high arched ceiling. Light flooded in through gigantic stained glass windows that painted colors across a mountain of tasseled pillows piled atop the bed. And the bed, draped in silk sheets and even larger than the one he had before. Toothless would fit right on it without even having to touch him. Hiccup knew he'd still sleep against the dragon. Somewhere along their travels, the habit had evolved from a comfort into a necessity. Hiccup had to turn his head to fully take in the full span of the marvel. Built into every wall was cushioned seating, interrupted by vases and columns and more statues. Each creation of stone glittered in the early afternoon light, dazzling his eyes to the clean curves and simple but ingenious design. Hiccup could easily ignore the Christian influence on most of the art. It was still stunning. The visionary within, the one that had been pushed to the very depth of his subconsciousness as he tried to make sense of his life, reared up with a vengeance. His fingers twitched. He had a mad urge to reach for his journal and... oh, he didn't have his journal. He fell from his abrupt, euphoric daze. Suddenly remembering where he was, why he was there, and who was right behind him, the young man spun on his heel in a show of agility not seen in weeks. Halfdan stood in the doorway, half a step from entering himself, his mouth opening and the beginning of a smile on his face. Hiccup slammed the door shut.
Oi!
He heard the indignant shout muffled through the thickness of the door, but Hiccup could draw every little satisfaction from the indignation. Twisting like that, bad idea. The young man remained bent over, one arm braced tightly against the door jamb, the other, stiff-fingered and shaking, hovered near his ribs as though unsure if applying pressure would help or not. He wasn't aware of whether he released a whimper of pain or not. He wasn't aware of how long he stayed like that until a dark nose nudged his shoulder. "You okay?" Hiccup turned his head, giving the dragon a weak smile.
"Yeah,"
he got out in a coarse whisper.
"Just being stupid."
"It was funny, if that helps."
"It does."
Hiccup grinned more easily and straightened, slow and considerate of his poor back. Damn it to hell, he was too young to be thinking elderly thoughts. He released a heavy breath and ran a hand through his much shorter hair. It felt soft between his fingers, light and fluffy and barely there. It could easily be compared to the silk clothing he wore. He was caught between annoyance and begrudging acceptance of this new development when a blurred motion in his peripheral caught his attention. He jumped, not anticipating any added company, and the sight of a man staring back at him wrenched his heart into a second convulsion of fright. A man tall and gaunt and framed in brass. A mirror. Hiccup sucked in a breath. It was a mirror that startled him, indirectly, and that would mean... His heart continued to thud savagely against his ribs from the scare. With his stomach still clenched in the sensation of a sudden drop, Hiccup hobbled closer to the looking-glass. Mirrors were rare enough, but he supposed royalty had plenty of them. The man across from him, the one trapped within the glass, approached with extreme caution. He was nervous, frightened that the wide-green eyes boring into his being were his own. He didn't know this person. This wasn't him. Hiccup swallowed, watching in morbid fascination as the Adam's apple in the reflection bobbed with the same movement. This was him. His hand came up, and long, spindly fingers traced an unfamiliar face. He could feel the rough patches over his cheekbones that were exposed to the most windburn, but never before could he see the shine of them. Such a ripe smudge against a youthful face. There used to be more fat around his mouth, but now his cheeks bore a slight concavity, adding emphasis to a broader jawbone than he recalled ever bearing. His brow hung over his eyes more, eyes set deeper, darker, his neck was thicker, his shoulders... Despite the weight he lost, his shoulders stretched wider, each end capped in a strapping curve of bone. His narrow, slight, abominable shoulders were no more, just gone. He had no idea. He could have never imagined. Toothless sidled in the picture from the left. With the dragon seated at his side, Hiccup realized they were at eye level with each other. He knew that he often met Toothless's eyes when the dragon sat and he stood, but seeing them side by side at a new perspective made him realize that he had grown. When? When had this happened? When he was hidden from the world, tripping over roots and ducking bows? The dragon's eyes were as impossibly wide as Hiccup's. The human would have laughed at such a matching, mismatched pair if he weren't currently battling hyperventilation. Wow! Toothless hushed to the picture painted in the glass. It's no wonder humans love me. I look good. The spell had broken, and Hiccup was able to tear his eyes away from his image and directed them onto Toothless. Arrogant twit, he murmured in a voice he thankfully remembered as his own. His eyes trailed back to himself, where the lips of the man had moved. Oddly enough, hearing the voice come from such a body seemed right, almost. They fit together better than his memory told of his appearance. Had his voice changed along with his body? He couldn't recall when it happened, but he felt like he had experienced moments of obvious changes. Still, something about Toothless's casual acceptance of their appearance struck Hiccup as off, and he narrowed his eyes at the Night Fury. You know what mirrors are? Why was Toothless not freaking out like he was? Unlike his human companion, Toothless was able to turn fully away from the mirror to give Hiccup the full brunt of his annoyance. I know what a reflection is, he deadpanned. Turning back to the mirror, Toothless brought his nose to the glass, sniffing. Mirrors. I like these mirrors. Definitely the best human invention ever. Hiccup snorted. He couldn't agree less. Unable to help himself, he touched the side of his face again. The touch felt familiar, but the sight was too surreal. This wasn't how Murky Waters depicted him to look. This wasn't the boy from his memory. He felt like he missed something along the way, like he jumped from boy to stranger in his time away from civilization and was now unprepared for the pang of loss that came with it. His hair brushed along his jaw and curled at the nape of his neck, longer than when he left Berk, though still choppy. More red highlights had blossomed along the strands after so much time in the sun, and the freckles. Red and brown speckled his face so thickly he could hardly find the shadow where his beard would grow. Nature had changed him nearly as much as time. He touched his hair again and frowned. Wish I was any good at braids, he grumbled, suddenly remembering and missing the Magyars. Cutwell had put the braids in his hair, and he left them undisturbed up until this day. He wished he could have seen himself with them in. He was sure they wouldn't have made a very big impact on his appearance, but they represented a piece of him that had been changed forever, simply because he met the right people at the right time. And then Hiccup realized what bothered him so much, or rather, one of the many things that bothered him. His fringe, the hair in front that didn't cut it shorter. Too much of his forehead was left visible. As if heard by the Norns themselves, a knock sounded on Hiccup's door, pulling his hand away from his head. He only paused to exchange a quick glance with Toothless before a short shamble across the floor had him back in front of the entryway. He pulled it open, hoping it was a Yazon, so he could get some more numbing medicines for the burn that continued to plague him. His face dropped when he saw Halfdan on the other end, appearing far less friendly after their recent parting. The man held out Hiccup's pack with one arm. His pack! They, the Varinjar, had kept it hostage to discourage his leaving, as if he could, but now it was returned to him at long last.
"You get this now."
Halfdan moved to step inside, fully intent on settling the bag himself. Oh no. Bracing himself for the pain he knew would follow, Hiccup snatched the bag out of Halfdan's hand, using all the strength of his mind and body to keep it lifted, wanting to make it look as easy for him as it was for Halfdan. Halfdan's mouth opened again, and Hiccup again slammed the door in his face. The bag crashed to the ground the second he was shielded from the judgment of the Viking stare.
"Oh, for the love of Freya's bouncing!"
The string of obscenities that followed caused Hiccup's eyebrows to rise through his pain, and was only silenced after a short but effective warning roar courtesy of Toothless. Hiccup breathed heavily through his nose. It hurt. Oh, how it hurt. But he could handle it, he could, and fell into a crouch to root through his pack rather than bending over. He didn't bother to check for the rubies or other valuables. He didn't take inventory of any kind. He went straight for his dagger. He found it in record time, the palpitating torment in his back ebbing by then, but he had to falter at the sight of Astrid's axe back with his belongings. They cleaned the blood, but Hiccup couldn't stop his hand from shaking when he brushed against its blade. He couldn't fight the winds as a phantom spasm ran across the lower wings of his shoulders. He wouldn't think about it. He wouldn't question why they gave it back to him, whether the intent was malicious or in good faith. His self-appointed mission was more important, and, dagger in hand, he steadily returned to the mirror. Toothless watched his human move in silence, not fully understanding what was going through his head, until he witnessed the boy uphold a measured pinch of fur at the top of his head before sawing against the strands. "You're doing more?" Toothless sounded shocked, though not altogether displeased. "It's wrong," Hiccup grunted, his face contorted against the pulse. The blade was dull and needed sharpening. After a few more hacks, he managed to create a similar replica of his choppy bangs. He swept them to the side. He looked more familiar. It would do. Hiccup sighed again, annoyed at several things. At what he had to do to his hair, at Halfdan, at this man that masqueraded as himself. He glared at his reflection in some weird attempt at self-intimidation to make his displeasure known at having such unfamiliarity thrust upon him. That was when he spotted it. Hiccup realized the most obvious, penetrating yet understated, difference between his memory of himself and the spectacle facing him. It wasn't his hair that was the problem. It was the character. He didn't slouch. He didn't curl into himself as he subconsciously would in his youth. Even injured, there was no latent attempt to protect himself from outside harm. A confidence radiated from his shoulders, his legs, his features. Subtle, slightly feral, but there. A powerful statement so alien, so novel to be coupled with him that he immediately dismissed it as wrong. He watched his eyes lighten, and some of that guarded mistrust lifted from his body language. This was him. This was who Domokos could see, this was who Gudrid wanted to kiss, and this was who the people of Miklagard regarded as a rider of the great dragon. Hiccup tried to smile. Sizably, his teeth looked less prominent amidst the larger, surrounding features, but the crooked flash of white put lines in his face that seemed to transform him further. He could still see himself in there. An element of danger had simply been added. Maybe he could accept this man as himself. One day. Hiccup didn't venture out of the palace for another 3 days. His back gave him quite a bit of trouble the day after the bath, and when he finally got around to admitting to Iazon why he was so sore, the man added to his pain with a sharp rap to the head for straining the healing injury. Hiccup stayed true to his therapy, though, determined to get back in shape. While taken aback by how much he had aged, he couldn't ignore the shallow areas of his body where his very flesh had been used to fuel his recovery. He wanted his mobility back to its full potential, and he walked and walked for as long as he were able each day, gaining a little more ground and adding to his stamina with each stroll. This day, this gray, chilled day that would have been considered mild back in Berg, Hiccup decided to venture outside. It rained the night before, so the well-trampled streets were damp with mud and footprints, giving the patient plenty of obstacles to steer through as he took in the sights. He expected the looks that followed him, but without a dragon or an empress at his side, most were what lingered from a double take. Wearing more locally accepted clothes and having a fresher, cleaner look to him gave Hiccup enough obscurity to get through the morning bustle without drawing a crowd. His dragon had not abandoned him. Toothless moved atop roofs, slinking along tiles and wood and having a blast trying not to get spotted whilst out in broad daylight. Sometimes he would call down to Hiccup and try and get a reaction out of the boy. "I found kittens," or "I think those females are staring at you," were the most common.
"Oi, Ryder!"
Ryder, Ippias, Veho, Vzatnik, Kalator. Never was he referred to as Hiccup in the city. It wasn't Toothless who called down to him this time. Granted, Toothless would never refer to him as such in the first place. No, every human ear in the vicinity could hear this voice that quite successfully destroyed what little anonymity Hiccup managed to hold on to until then. The young man's shoulders seized at the familiar tone, and he turned with an exaggerated halt, intent on showing his annoyance at every given chance. His eyes fell upon Halfdan's hulking form, shoving the odd, unfortunate individual out of the way. He was larger than most who surrounded him, so parting the crowd wasn't a problem, and before Hiccup could duck into the masses, he had an unwanted Viking at his hip.
"Where you headin'?"
Halfdan asked, friendly as could be.
"By Odin, will you leave me alone?"
Hiccup hissed, turning to continue his aimless journey through the crowd. Now then he had more attention than he ever desired, a clear path had formed, enhanced by the Varinja next to him. Hiccup dearly wished Toothless would spring down on top of the man, but the dragon, for once, was nowhere to be found.
"No can do,"
Halfdan responded to Hiccup's complaint.
"Told you, I was going to make things right again, so here I am."
"You can make things right by turning around and walking in the other direction."
"Don't be like that now, lad. Do you even know where you're going?"
"Away from you. Stop following me."
Halfdan laughed deeply, as if Hiccup had told the funniest joke to ever grace the tables of Valhalla, and Hiccup was stuck with a mad urge to take his dagger and stab the man in the kneecap. A lot of good it would do him, considering the last time it was sharpened. Hiccup came to an abrupt stop, his head jerking around to face Halfdan.
"Do you have a blacksmith around here?"
Halfdan heartened considerably at Hiccup directing something other than contempt at him.
"Course,"
he said brightly.
"We got 3, city this big and all, though only one speaks Norse. Not too well, but take what you can get, I suppose. I can take you to him if—"
"Is he looking for an apprentice?"
Hiccup broke in, unable to keep the eagerness from his voice. It would be the perfect way for him to bulk up while brushing up on skills he feared were rusting, and possibly earn a little side cash. The rubies were still there, nothing had been taken from his belongings, amazingly, but the thought of acquiring more money never failed to brighten Hiccup's day. Halfdan's smile slipped a bit at the other's clear intention.
"Oh, well, no. He's not got one, but he's not the nicest either."
If Halfdan hoped to discourage such thoughts from brewing in Hiccup's head, he failed.
"Good,"
Hiccup declared.
"Take me to him."
Mean he could deal with. All this worshipping was driving him round the bend. Halfdan started off in another direction, Hiccup in tail, but the man continued in his cautioning.
"He's a Russ,"
Halfdan warned.
He's a downright grouch, he is."
"I'm a grouch to you, too,"
Hiccup wanted to say, but instead asked,
"What's a Ross?"
"What's a... Oh, I mean, he was part of a Rinjar, but got a little too old, and now's taken up an old craft. He's part of a group that came from the north, but the other north, way out east."
Hiccup thought back on his map that he had scrutinized and refolded until the creases wore out some of the labels.
"Like around Novgorod?"
He tried. Halfdan snapped his fingers.
"Aye, exactly. Round those parts. He pretends he doesn't know Norse just so he can yell at you in Russian. I'm telling you, kid, get whatever business you need done there and get out. Man's a lunatic."
"I'll take my chances,"
Hiccup rebuffed wryly. Lunatic? Is that a type of insect? Hiccup faltered to a stumble and looked skyward, finding a pair of lime-green eyes peering down at him from over a roof's edge.
"Oh, there you are,"
Hiccup exclaimed, not bothering to be subtle now that he already had his own identity announced.
"Where have you been?"
"I found a fish. See?" Toothless popped his head fully over the premise to show Hiccup the huge trout dangling from his mouth. "Have you eaten?" Hiccup was not impressed.
"You didn't find anything. You stole that."
"Might do all right with the nutter, actually."
Hiccup heard Halfdan mutter, but it was easy enough to ignore. "I don't have to steal," Toothless argued, haughty as can be. "People look at me and feel the need to give me stuff. And after that mirror, I know why."
"Yeah,"
Hiccup scoffed, not buying a word of it.
"It's called manipulation, and I am not eating that."
"You should. You look hungry. I saved you the best one."
"Stall's right over there,"
Halfdan announced, his bushy red eyebrows reaching towards his hairline as he jerked a thumb over his shoulder.
"But if you prefer to stand there shouting to the skies, that's okay by me."
"No, I think I'm done,"
Hiccup said, as if he were just browsing for a new belt and not engaged in a very public, one-sided argument. He turned back to the roof and for some added insurance yelled, "Don't you dare drop that on my head." Toothless flapped an earplate at him. "Relax, I already ate it." And remarkably, the fish was nowhere to be seen. Shaking his head, Hiccup departed from the thickened crowd, leaving those that were once staring at him to admire the dragon instead.
"Can you really understand him?"
Halfdan asked as they neared a tent-like structure posing as a smith's shop.
"Or is it just for show?"
Hiccup squinted at the very open stall. He could just make out a large shadow moving between hanging appliances and a barely visible, bricked-in fire.
"Does it matter?"
Hiccup was too distracted to give much thought to Halfdan's question, especially considering the man would never believe him in the first place. Not only did Hiccup want to meet this apparently mean Russ, but now Toothless brought his hunger to attention.
"Well, I personally believe it has to do with dragon magics."
Hiccup suppressed an eye roll.
"Very few dragons have the magics you're talking about, and Toothless isn't one of them."
"Did he tell you that?"
"Yes."
"And you believe him?"
"Yes."
"How do you know he didn't use his magics to make you believe him?"
They had reached the most open side of the stall, where Halfdan gave the impression of delay, the first traces of nervousness Hiccup had yet to witness visible on his ruddy face. Hiccup slapped a hand to the side of his face with theatric force.
"You're right. How could I not have considered such an insidious plan? It must have been his evil dragon magics that made such an obvious conclusion slip my mind."
Halfdan narrowed his eyes, abandoning his unease.
"I'm not sure how much more of your attitude I can tolerate."
Hiccup raised his chin and shrugged.
"Go then. I'm not sure how much of your presence I can tolerate,"
he mocked. Call him childish, but he certainly enjoyed the way he finally got Halfdan to glower. It only took him 3 days.
"Oh, that is it, you... Oi, Intruders, what do you want? Ihr beschmutzt meine Schmiede mit eurem widerlichen ausländischen Geschwätz."
A boulder of a man crept up on both of them, a feat that should have been impossible by the sheer size of the undeniable blacksmith. The smith stood almost an entire head taller than Halfdan, with a substantial gut and trunk-like arms. A wiry blond beard covered more of his face than skin was visible, and traveled down his throat and beneath his tunic. Somewhere along the line it must have transformed into chest hair, but there was no distinct break revealing skin. This man was just a step away from becoming a full-on yellow bear.
"Hello there, Damien."
Halfdan greeted with a respectful tip of his head.
There is, the rider.
Hiccup curled his lip. Really? Did he really forget his name? But Halfdan pretended he did nothing wrong.
He wanted to come here and see you.
And then Halfdan had the audacity to look pleadingly for Hiccup to pick things up from there. Hiccup was reminded that Halfdan was a follower, and despite the man's own impressive size, he would answer to anyone obviously more powerful than himself. No questioning, no fighting the system, just pure Viking pecking order. Maaaaan turned heavy-lidded eyes onto the smaller being standing beside the Varinjar.
I know who he is.
Maaaaan grunted in barely articulate words. He appeared frustrated and was most likely interrupted from a project, going by the soot shining on his forehead and clinging to his hair.
Mir den Schwachsinn hier anzuhören ist doch reine Zeitverschwendung. Tell me what you want now, or leave.
I need my dagger sharpened,
Hiccup announced in a clear voice. He'd faced down a sea serpent before. This man would not intimidate him. He pulled his blade from his belt, but held it just out of Maaaan's reach when the smith went to grab for it.
However, I want to do it myself.
Maaaaan scowled, or at least Hiccup thought he was scowling. It was hard to tell with features that seemed permanently contorted in such an expression to begin with, but the already droopy cheeks turned downwards in confusion.
I do not understand.
Maaaaan looked at Halfdan for clarification. Halfdan grimaced.
I'm not too sure myself.
He leaned into Hiccup.
Oi, this is a bad idea, kid.
Stop,
Hiccup ground out with deliberate slowness.
Calling me kid.
He swept his eyes briefly over to Halfdan when he spoke, but otherwise did not change his posture from Maaaaan, a dismissal tactic he picked up on from Toothless. It had the intended effect of silencing the Viking while giving the impression that, while his words were quite serious, he did not warrant Hiccup's full attention. Hiccup couldn't help analyzing things. He knew this about himself, and he stopped fighting it long ago. With Vikings being such a huge part of who he was, eventually breaking down Viking behavior would cross his mind one too many times to ignore. It was only after he left Berk and had the privilege of seeing Vikings from an outsider's point of view, arguably not being an outsider himself, that a general pattern among the hard-headed populace came to light. Showing the first sign of weakness was the equivalent of admitting to being a pushover, and any hope to be taken seriously, ever, would end there. Hiccup had been viewed as weak from day one in Berk, and never had a chance to make a stand, and every attempt to bring his views into light was like trying to stay afloat in a whirlpool long after a rescue ship had sailed. But here, back in the company of Vikings that had no preconceptions of him, Hiccup had been nothing but ostentatious. It wasn't intentional at first. He simply reacted according to the situation. But he quickly realized that, by maintaining this attitude, helped greatly by lingering righteous anger and resentment, he could earn the agreement of the Vikings far more easily. The more stubborn his reputation, the less resistance he received to his ideas and his wants. Having a supercilious dragon at his back didn't hurt either. Of course, said dragon was, once again, not where Hiccup wanted him. Example given, right behind him.
I want to work for you,
Hiccup reworded, drawing up as much stony determination as he could in his features. Dark gray eyes narrowed.
Yet.
No translation needed there. But Hiccup would not be deterred. He was getting his way on this. He didn't care how many times this Russ could break him in half. Now was the moment to build a character to these Vikings, not in the hippodrome, not in his speedy recovery, but here, in this smith stall, staring down a man that made members of the Varinjar nervous. Hiccup just needed good footing, something that would give him a bit of leverage, like back with Arnulf. Once he got going, he could use his own form of intimidation, or bribing, whatever it would come to first.
My dragon will tear you to pieces if you don't.
Always safe to start with his most obvious power. Maaaaan snorted.
I see no dragon.
You know I have one. You know who I am.
Name-dropping?
Not caring much.
Maaaaan yawned.
I kill dragon and then kill you for wasting time.
No go. Which left,
I will pay you.
Maaaan's heavy jaw shifted. A good sign.
How much?
Ruby.
The long caterpillar eyebrow waved as Demian grunted.
I do not believe you.
I'll show you,
Hiccup quickly promised, pushing.
I'll bring you tomorrow for my first day as your apprentice. It won't be forever either. I'll be leaving eventually.
The silence that followed was so stifling even Halfdan ceased his fidgeting. Hiccup met the frosty stare head-on, not daring to blink or show the slightest sign of nervousness. Humans would not scare him.
Rosja!
Demian barked, causing Halfdan to start and Hiccup's heart to lurch.
But you will be sorry.
Hiccup's stomach flipped. Victory. Victory. He smiled, showing off all those teeth that made Toothless nervous.
You won't be,
he promised, and the fact that he seemed so happy under the duress of such a terrifying man probably had Halfdan questioning whether Hiccup had recovered mentally after all. Hiccup turned on his heel and walked out, feeling energized, the smile ready to split his face. He didn't care if he just signed a death warrant. He got his way against 2 Vikings. Granted, he'd be down a ruby, and he did plan on paying, but nothing could beat the feeling of bringing his plans to fruition by his own power. He was going to get his strength back. It would be hard, and he was sure Demian would not be lenient on him for his delicate condition, but it would happen. He was going to learn how to make arrows, and he was going to use them with Fromherja. And he was going to only impress Thor enough so that hopefully the god would lose interest in him without killing him. Hiccup hadn't even needed Toothless at his back to scare the Vikings into agreeing with him. In fact, Toothless was too busy sniping fish off a merchant's cart that was, unfortunately for the merchant, stationed a bit too close to a heavily shadowed area between buildings.
Oh, for the love of it, Toothless, no!
His sudden holler caused the merchant-turned victim to first stare at Hiccup and then follow his line of sight to the dark triangular head that peeked from the laneway. The vendor shouted in surprise, though hardly any anger was present in his voice. Seeing a dragon's head snitching fish would surely give anyone a scare, but after the initial shock wore off, an unsure smile wormed its way onto the man's face. Hiccup shook his head. These reactions only encouraged Toothless. He noticed the stares returning rather swiftly. It seemed for each new set of eyes that lay upon him or the dragon, another 3 would somehow follow. Hiccup already had 2 public conversations with Toothless in a short time span, which, as usual, made him look like a nutter, as Halfdan put it. That Toothless no longer hid himself in the shadows only served to attract more attention. Surprisingly, Hiccup couldn't bring himself to care. A very good mood had struck, and he intended to hold on to it. His life had taken a turn for the bizarre, that was for sure, but he prided himself on being adaptable. If this was his life, he'd make it work until it changed again. Though he enjoyed the positive attention, Toothless, much like Hiccup, preferred to be admired from afar. He snapped his teeth at the boy for giving away his position and, in a singular, impressive move, leapt onto the roof of the building he hugged. Somewhere in Hiccup's mind, he wondered if Toothless had always been able to jump that high, and realized that, if he had, he would have been able to get out of the cove back at their first meeting. Weird. What was that for? Toothless growled down at him. Hiccup's lips twitched at the now out-of-reach dragon.
You're going to get fat if you keep this up,
Hiccup replied, and started his journey back to his room, not bothering to see if Halfdan still followed. Toothless reared his head back at the insinuation. What? I'm supposed to get this big? Wow, this conversation seemed familiar and backwards at the same time.
You got rubies?
And Halfdan was suddenly beside him, predictably asking about Hiccup's choice of payment and cutting into the private conversation.
I count them before I sleep every night,
Hiccup lied. It sounded more dangerous anyway. Halfdan looked shocked at the subtle accusation.
I ain't got thoughts of stealing in my head.
Like you would dare,
Hiccup muttered. He had seen Halfdan's true colors. He was sure the man was a terrifying sight to behold on the battlefield, but in the face of a more powerful ally, he bowed to the greater prowess.
Can I see him?
The redhead asked. If Halfdan thought he was following Hiccup all the way to his bedroom, he had another thing coming.
No.
Please?
You're ruining my good mood.
I'll stop asking if you let me see him.
No.
I'm not going to stop.
How old are you? 42, 43, 44.
Hiccup counted in soft grunts, hardly above a whisper. His arms shook. His stomach muscles clenched and unclenched with each ascent from the floor. He kept his core tight, spreading the tension throughout as much of his body as he could to thin the strain. His arms stayed close to his sides, elbows tucked in, facing his hips, in a method to redirect the burden from his shoulders to his lower abdominal muscles. Increasing his speed would surely be easier at reaching a higher number, but Hiccup had it drilled into his head that slow and steady did the trick for strengthening more effectively than quick, repetitive motions. A strong back started with a strong stomach, and while most would think push-ups worked the arms, it was also a fantastic way to develop core strength. He couldn't do sit-ups yet. His back would not handle the varying pressure well. But by breathing correctly, as Domokos had shown him, and by knowing how to target certain muscles, he would be able to regain his strength without accidentally pushing back his progress. As soon as he was strong enough, Framhuria would be the first weapon his hands would wield. He ached to use her. Something as beautiful as that bow should not spend its day collecting dust against the wall. But he'd be a fool to reverse all the work done by hurting himself right off the bat. No. He needed to be smart about this. He needed a strong foundation to fall back on before attempting to operate a gift from the gods. Toothless, locked in a comfy-looking curl, studied Hiccup's workout from the bed, his tail swishing in agitation.
"You're tired,"
he mentioned when Hiccup's breathing became too heavy to ignore. Hiccup blew out in place of counting 47. He was starting to slow as well. He did 45 yesterday, he wanted to make it to 50 today.
"You used to be able to do a lot more before getting tired."
And Toothless's morose observation was not helping Hiccup's morale. The boy finally dropped his knees to the floor and pushed back from his plank position to rest on his haunches.
"I used to be able to do a lot of things without getting tired,"
Hiccup lamented. Though he still found it unusual to feel the cool burn of his muscles so quickly, he was thankful for being able to do this at all. Being bedridden for weeks on end had done wonders for his appreciation of free movement. Regardless, while the progress was exciting, retraining was such a pain. Toothless moaned, low and sad.
"Will you ever be able to do as many as you used to?"
"Yeah,"
Hiccup waved off. He was back on his feet. Rather than continuing his workout, he moved to the bed, flopping down next to Toothless and leaving his legs to dangle off the edge. His body sunk into the mattress, and Hiccup closed his eyes, enjoying the sensation of weightlessness. He could feel the strong breath of air that pushed against his face when Toothless brought his snout to his cheek.
"I'm sorry."
A small smile tugged at the corner of Hiccup's lips. He didn't open his eyes.
"Sorry? For what?"
"For what happened to you. I don't know if I said it before."
The smile was gone. Hiccup opened his eyes and kept them focused on the ceiling rather than looking at his dragon.
"You didn't have to."
Never in a million years would Hiccup blame Toothless. He drew first blood, so to speak. He would never have the right to be angry at the dragon for injuries on his behalf. Not for as long as Toothless's tail was lopsided, and not for long after that.
"None of this should have happened."
"I wanted to come here,"
Hiccup reminded him.
"I got us into the situation."
"I could have said something,"
Toothless argued in like.
"I didn't. And I didn't fight hard enough when they had you brought out to that death area."
"You were injured too."
Hiccup started to feel the first tendrils of annoyance toward Toothless and a sudden, uncharacteristic show of remorse. It was so delayed, so out of place after Hiccup had already come to terms with what happened as a most unfortunate punishment for being lackadaisical. His impatience must have seeped through his words because Toothless lowered his head to come to a final rest on Hiccup's chest. Hiccup's heartbeat had always been quicker than his own, far quicker, but prominent within the smaller body. It never ceased to amaze Toothless that such a small being could drum with so much life.
"I think I'm realizing now what you gave up."
And he never ceased to underestimate human recovery. This whole experience didn't just affect Hiccup's body. It affected his mind. It made him sad for much too long, angry and bitter. Hiccup brought one arm up to pillow his head as his other stroked the scales on Toothless's brow.
"You can't always be the one saving me, buddy. I will get back to normal and This time, I'll need to be stronger than before."
Toothless purred at the touch, returning the comforting gesture with warm vibrations. "I always thought you were fine the way you were."
"I know. I didn't think so."
"Do you like who you are now?" Hiccup paused before answering honestly.
"I'm getting there."
"I hope I am not interrupting anything."
Both boys lifted their heads and turned towards the door like synchronized puppets. Hiccup had only met her once, but he could immediately recognize the woman as Theodora, Zoe's sister. Royalty in the room. Hiccup sat up fully.
"Oh, no.
He bounced off the bed with a nervous chuckle, standing up straight in her presence.
"We were just resting."
She smiled, benign yet guarded, and stepped fully into the light-flooded space. The net of gold chains shawled over her head jingled faintly with each light step. Theodora did not have her sister's beauty. In fact, even without the comparison, she was rather plain-looking. But from what Hiccup heard through half-hushed murmurs, she possessed the wit that Zoe lacked.
"Can I help you with anything?"
Hiccup asked awkwardly. He tried not to fidget. He was only garbed in brays, showing off the damage done to his physique nicely. Not the best attire befitting of encountering royalty, especially when the woman wore patterns of dramatic colors and expensive jewels to better contrast his lack of dress.
"Oh, no,"
she answered demurely.
"I only came to see how you were liking it here. I heard the rumor that you are now apprenticing to the blacksmith."
Her Norse was better than her sister's, with a lighter accent.
Yes, I am."
"That is good to keep busy. But does it bother you, being around the guard?"
Hiccup shared a quick look with Toothless. No one before had ever brought up any possible discomfort on his behalf for being in so much contact with the people who hurt him. Not even the Empress.
"I'll be okay,"
Hiccup responded once he got his jaw working. Theodora had a similar game face as her sister, but already Hiccup gleaned an entirely different person from beneath that carefully controlled exterior. The woman smiled, another partially forced one that told Hiccup the sensibility came with a lack of easiness shown in Zoe.
"How long are you planning to stay?"
Theodora asked with innocent inquiry.
Until I'm better, I guess."
Hiccup shrugged. He looked down at himself, at the depressions between his ribs.
"I still have quite a ways to go."
"Yes, I can see that,"
Theodora commented.
"Concerning your time here, I came to warn you. A shift in power may occur again. It would be best to be on your guard."
Hiccup took an involuntary step backwards, astonished at such compelling information given so freely.
"Is your sister losing the throne?"
he asked. A usurpation? A natural passing of power? Or was it a threat? A threat that her sister may die soon, by accident or nature. Or perhaps a threat had already occurred? Maybe an outside source made it known that a change in power would be forced upon Miklagard. If so, had he and Toothless and the sensation they caused be indirectly behind it? Theodora opened her mouth to answer, but a sharp voice cut across the room.
"Theodora!"
Zoe snapped, barely keeping her voice at a reasonable volume. Seeing as she had the effect of ceasing their conversation, whilst garnering their attention, the Empress continued in a far more delicate tone.
"Iparosia, suene rapatia you."
Theodora pursed her lips, hesitating for only a moment under Zoe's piercing stare, before abruptly departing with a demure nod in Hiccup's direction. She turned using graceful, almost inhumanly fluid motions that must have taken decades of training to perfect, and exited the room. Time seemed to slow as she passed her sister, the two women engaged in a silent battle of wills while caught beneath the doorframe. A pressure permeated from the pair, affecting even Hiccup, who held his breath, almost positive one may hit the other. And then Theodora's feet continued her departure, and the tension broke. Hiccup stared, mouth slightly ajar, and wondered if that had actually happened. Did they hate each other?
"Theodora is extremely busy,"
Zoe said in a cool tone she had yet to use on him.
"Please, do not bother her again."
Hiccup nearly replied that she had come to his room, but a blink later and Zoe had suddenly been replaced by Halfdan. Wait, what? Halfdan stood in the doorway, managing to take up a good chunk of the space between frames while glancing out and down the hall where the Empress must have followed her sister. He whistled lowly.
"Trouble in the castle,"
he murmured, still following the wake of the princess with his eyes. He turned back to Hiccup, arms crossed and mouth open, prepared to say something when his eyes bugged out of his head.
"Were you really wearing that?"
He choked in a poorly concealed laugh.
"In front of them?"
Yep,
Hiccup quipped with half-lidded eyes. Nothing he could really do about it. Besides, it wasn't like he was naked. Still chortling, Halfdan took a few steps into the room.
"Well, I came to ask if you wanted to go for a run. See how that back's treating you."
Hiccup shrugged. A light jog would give him a good judge of where he stood in his recovery, as long as he didn't push himself too far.
sure.
And he immediately set to scrounging around for clothes.
"How's that Smith job going?"
Halfdan started with his usual small-talk attempts.
Good.
Hiccup insisted as he pulled on one of the many tunics gifted to him by the Empire. He would never admit to the several near accidents that seemed to happen all around him, all of which he suspected were caused by Maaaaan. On more than one occasion, Hiccup was forced to loudly announce how no one would get any rubies if he died on the job.
I'm making arrows tomorrow. We'll test them out then.
Perhaps Halfdan knew a thing or two about smithing, because he looked rather impressed.
"Already? Does Maaaaan know this?"
Hiccup grinned, the first honest smile he ever gave the insistent Viking.
He will.
A week passed since Hiccup announced the start of his new project. It actually took him 3 days to convince Maaaaan to teach him the craft, and another 4 until he was satisfied with the results. He had burns running up and down his arms from his challenging apprenticeship, shiny flecks that brought him more nostalgia than pain. Maaaaan made the job more dangerous than it needed to be, as if testing Hiccup in more than just skill, but Hiccup relished in the absolute contrast of the environment to life outside the workplace. 3 weeks had passed since he started walking longer distances. 2 since he started seriously retraining himself. And now, at the very end of the year, on this grey, overcast day, Hiccup felt ready to try out Framherja. He moved through the streets with Halfdan at his side and Framherja against his back. It was impossible to unstring her. Some supernatural element kept her line taut and frame strong. Toothless followed in his usual lofty fashion, occasionally using his wings to glide to a different rooftop rather than leaping, drawing up a good batch of delighted oohs each time. Hiccup had at long last come to the conclusion that if there were any Viking he would get along with, it would be Halfdan. And not because he particularly liked the guy. There were too many faults with Halfdan to name, but because not getting along with him was like deciding to develop an aversion to his own shadow. He wouldn't truly get along with Halfdan until he gave the man a shiner so bright people would see it in the dark. Just one good, solid hit to the face, then they would be even. Sort of. He'd have to hit him extra hard. Harold mentioned bringing Hiccup around to sparring now that he gained enough mobility, and Hiccup planned on getting nice and strong before repaying Halfdan for striking him at their first meeting. Then, and only then, would he consider the man an associate. Still, Hiccup felt comfortable enough around the Viking not to keep up the irritated facade all the time.
What's up with the sisters?
He asked, breaking the brief and rare silence that fell between the two as they traveled towards the hippodrome. Really, Hiccup should have known Vikings wouldn't have been sensitive to any lingering insecurities he felt about the place. Fortunately, Hiccup thought it would be good for him to face down the arena. His last memories of the place, in fact, were not bad.
Jealousy issue is the crux of it,
Halfdan replied, not needing to ask which sisters Hiccup referred to.
Empress Zoe's got the power and the birthright, but Theodora's got the political know-how. Empress always been prettier, that's for sure, and she's gotten everything for it. But she knows, and we know, that Theodora would be a better leader. It's the knowing that's the problem, you see.
If Theodora's a better leader, why wouldn't Zoe step down for the sake of the Empire?
Or was self-sacrifice a foreign concept to these people? Halfdan laughed, and this one echoed more hollowly, lacking his usual bluster.
The Empress would never let that happen if she could help it. Besides, she can't go and change her hold over things now. She's had Theodora held down for almost as long as she's been in power. Theodora's been under surveillance for most of her life, usually banished to a convent or some such place.
Hiccup furrowed his brow. This sounded a bit too malicious for the woman who adored Toothless so much.
Zoe would do that?
He questioned, his disbelief palpable. Halfdan looked down, annoyed.
Stop calling her Zoe like you're on a first-name basis with her. You obviously don't know her that well if you're shocked. She went and killed her first husband, for Christ's sake. Bet you didn't know that.
What?
Hiccup hardly paid heed to the road any more. Halfdan had his full attention.
Aye,
Halfdan nodded.
Found dead in his bath. And it weren't drowning that did it, neither. Second one was blinded and sent to a monastery.
Halfdan seemed to enjoy Hiccup's growing horror.
Now it's her nephew that's the technical ruler, or was. See, he didn't trust her after her history with disposing emperors and tried to banish her the way she banished her sister. Didn't turn out so good. People got real mad about that. She's back now, more popular than ever, and a lot of thanks goes to you and your dragon. Michael V is pretty much booted from the throne for trying to pull that stunt.
I had no idea,
Hiccup mumbled. He knew Zoe wasn't all that fond of him as a person, and he could tell plain as day she enjoyed the publicity he and Toothless dredged up for her, but that she was so underhanded was something he had not foreseen. Halfdan nodded.
What the real kicker is, and it's why the ladies have been so cold to each other, is that the court finally sees that the Empress isn't going to improve her, tactics. If she don't find a new emperor to rule alongside of her, she may have to grant Theodora more power and make her co-ruler. As you can imagine, the Empress don't like that idea too much.
Yeah,
Hiccup muttered. His entire view of the woman had been flipped within a single, short walk.
And now she's got her eye on Harold.
Hiccup's head snapped up.
What?
He must have heard wrong.
Zoe, the Empress wants to marry Harold?
Harold wasn't as young as Halfdan, but he was far younger than Zoe. It would be an unusual match, to say the least.
Aye, but Harold's not stupid. No man in his right mind would get involved with that woman. Title of emperor's not worth it.
Halfdan dug his fingers into his beard, scratching at the skin beneath the hair with a rough scritching sound.
He actually has his eye on the Empress's niece. Forgot her name, but the Empress knows this, so she's pissed about that.
Hiccup shook his head. He didn't care to hear much more about the drama that went on within the palace walls, as long as it didn't directly affect him.
So, I should trust Theodora over Zoe?
He needed a clear direction on where to keep his eyes if he planned on sleeping in that palace any longer. Not that anyone could get near him with Toothless snoozing at his side. Halfdan sneered at the idea, an expression lost within the shadows that wiped over the crossing into the hippodrome.
If Theodora showed an interest in you, it's to help get out from under the Empress's thumb. She needs her own leverage if the co-ruling don't work out. Know that. My advice, don't trust anyone in that palace. Hell, you shouldn't trust women in the first place.
Halfdan paused, the weak sun shining on them once more, allowing Hiccup to see the calculating look given to him.
Say, how old are you?
Hiccup shrunk back, not liking the gleam in the man's eye.
Why?
He asked, wary.
Took you too long enough.
They had reached the arena without Hiccup even realizing, and now he found himself face to distant face with Harold. The blond, armored man stood by a crafted target, a rounded pad of cloth stuffed with cotton and hay, concentric circles painted down the center in a bullseye.
Aye, we're here, aren't we?
Halfdan grinned back.
Now, let's see this baby in action.
Hiccup only cast Halfdan an annoyed look for his excessive enthusiasm, only he should be this excited, and unslung the golden bow. Harold approached the pair, planning on shortening the gap that separated them, but before he could get within 5 fathom of Hiccup, a dark winged form dropped down to separate them. Toothless curled his lip at Harold, determined that a maximum proximity had been reached. Halfdan had apologized, but Harold still refused. That meant, by Toothless's account, that a certain distance must always be maintained between his human and the Viking. Hiccup, for his part, wasn't happy about Harold being present for this moment. A moment he considered rather special and more than anticipated, but as soon as his recovery started to pick up speed, Harold had taken to keeping tabs on him. He almost became as annoying as Halfdan, with how he would pop up at every opportunity, asking if Hiccup felt ready to try out the bow. Hiccup agreed to the man's witnessing his first test of it on the condition that Harold promised to help train Hiccup to his full potential and that no one else was present. He long stopped caring about what Halfdan did. Unless Halfdan did something stupid, like pull an arrow from the satchel slung over his other shoulder, one that he purchased a while ago, made with hardened leather and quite durable. "You made these?" Halfdan asked, dragging his finger over the smooth, flat side of the head, openly impressed. "Not bad. Not bad at all." Instead of saying thanks to the compliment, Hiccup snatched it from the large hand, eyes narrowed at the gall of the man.
Don't touch.
"Want to move closer?"
Harold asked. Hiccup was sure Harold didn't mean it as an insult when he gestured to the well-distant target, but his lip pulled back at the implication. He wasn't that handicapped. Harold held up his hands.
Fine. Just thought you might want a closer target after."
"The next closest target is you," Toothless informed him, knowing too well that it went unheard. So long as it brought a smile to Hiccup's face, he'd be fine with that. And, indeed, Hiccup smiled, giving the dragon a good scratch on the neck before squaring off to the target. He had practiced drawing the bow without arrows a couple times to test his limitations. It fit perfectly in his grip, a bone ring not even necessary with a string that, impossibly, didn't hurt him. Even when not in peak physical condition, Hiccup would make arrows fly with his bow. He knocked the arrow Halfdan so thoughtfully chose for him. Despite the care and effort that went into crafting the shaft and head, it just didn't measure up to the beauty of Fromherja. No arrow would, sadly. Hiccup dragged the taut string back by the crook of his thumb. Something electrifying butted in his chest as excitement welled. He was here, he was doing this, finally, and just as he reached the peak of his draw, an instant before he released the projectile that he put so much effort into crafting, the arrow burst into flames. Hiccup yelped at the sudden flash of light and the intense heat around his fingers and cheek. He hardly heard the other cries of alarm as he dropped from Fromherja. The weapon thudded to the ground, not a scratch or burn on it, as innocent and beautiful as always beneath the dusting of the arrow's ashen remains.
What?
Hiccup gasped.
"The hell,"
murmured Halfdan. Was that?